Okay, here we go. Yeah, so the first iteration of this presentation was given to Assemble. So we had a slide which was introducing Louis to Assemble, but maybe it's good to just both do intros because the mixed group, and if we're recording it anyway. Yeah, this is Louis giving the kind of spiel from the presentation to some llamas in Sheffield. Thinking about, not just the human beings. It's important to talk to the other creatures on the earth. Do you want to introduce yourself and then I can just go after?
Yeah, so my name's Louis, and most of you know me already. For the benefit of people who are watching recording, I practice. I studied architecture, and now I work mainly in what you call social architecture, which is doing social projects, normally with community groups, but also kind of like developing strategies, initial research. So I started a number of projects or social enterprises, the first being the Foodle Project, which then led on to me starting another project called the National Food Service project, which is now a network across the country of similar initiatives and also projects that have sprung out of that. So then I left the National Food Service project and started working a lot with Fran and connecting with some of those projects. We did some workshops in IASA, and I've also obviously been involved and a tutor in IASA for several years. So kind of connecting all of these dots together with things like AB, but also other projects we're doing within IASA and beyond within kind of the House of Annetta and some other things that I'll talk about in a moment. But AB is essentially something that builds and progresses things in the way that I guess both myself and Fran resonate with around how architecture practice could be practiced, not necessarily how it is. So it's trying to kind of create a new model. So yeah, it's exciting to share that with you guys today.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're gonna give a basic.
Do you want to introduce yourself, Fran, as well?
Oh yeah. Hi. Sorry. I am called Fran, and I am a person who's been working with the group Assemble for the last 12 years, doing kind of self-build projects and architectural projects that try and think about the ways in which space and human relations and life is organized, not just in terms of like physical material stuff, but also in the kind of like invisible architectures and the cultures that are provided for, and kind of ways of relating that are made possible through organization and like ways of relating to space and education and different things like this. So yeah, I met Louis a few years ago when he came to do a presentation to Assemble about the National Food Service, and since then we've just been talking, but we'll kind of go through the presentation today is like the kind of culmination of like, I guess, like a couple of years of conversations, and so we're going to go through like basically the whole like high level ambition of like what AB could be, and then set out kind of themes and aims that we're thinking about, the kind of process that's happened so far that's got us to this point, and then how we envisage that AB will work in terms of a kind of iterative like action research process as a practice of research and testing basically. And then we'll talk a little bit about the different kinds of work that are happening currently, and that then a little bit about the organization, and then the partnership thing with, is not just with Assemble, but with other networks of which you're all a part of. I think we're still in a really early phase, and I think the language still needs to keep on evolving, but essentially AB is a kind of experimental organization that exists to create structures we need for a more equitable society. So it's quite high level, but yeah, with a clear kind of like commitment to equity and making new and different kind of structures. So do you want to talk about social architecture?
One of the I guess one of the major differences that we spotted within the practice of architecture as it is, and I guess the practice of the potential of architecture as it's perceived, is the kind of practice of architecture as just physical space and series of creating physical spaces, and the kind of unclear definition of what we're terming kind of social architecture practice. And they kind of, I think at their root, they have quite different methodologies, whereas one might be looking at kind of architecture as a traditional kind of study that you might learn in kind of universities. The other is starting to look at architecture as a social science. So following this kind of process of observing things that are really happening in the world, creating a hypothesis around that, creating tangible small scale experiments, and working and understanding what their results are, and then sharing and distributing those results and creating evidence bases based on that. So a lot of the projects that I guess both myself and Fran have been involved with have started off with this concept of prototypes, or kind of creating prototypes and testing, and then once there's something solid and robust, you can kind of build on that, and it might not always look exactly how it's either dreamt up or even expected to look at the very beginning of the project, because you're relating to the real social domain that we actually exist within. But and the idea is that hopefully, I guess with social architecture you can expand this, as well as that, like social architecture practice starts to explore different ideas of and the reality of how we organize architectural labor. For example, a lot of architectural labor is about around the kind of stepped system, and that there's a clear defined beginning and a clear defined end. But the reality of the world that we're living in, and also the reality of the management systems that are modern, are that there's closed loop management systems, or kind of like the idea of the beginning and the end isn't always so clear. And actually feedback being a kind of really vital innovation in the last 6 years, that when the RIBA plan of work and these other plans were created, this concept wasn't so prevalent. And that's something, I guess, that starts to inform ideas around a new definition of social architecture practice in relation to the kind of work that I've been doing, in relation to the kind of work Fran's been doing, and I guess many people within EASA do, and kind of other social practitioners who are beyond the field of architecture, but also traditional architecture, but also are practicing what you might call social architecture.
Yeah, but I think it's really important to say that it's not just, I mean, as a person who's not ever studied architecture, it's not just about people who identify as being architects, but also, yeah, people, anyone, as Louis just said, anyone kind of working with design and the kind of construction of space or material things, but still having a kind of like critical awareness and trying to really interrogate those like, interplays between the physical and the non-physical structures. So yeah, we're going to start with this carpet page, which is a really incredible drawing, which is essentially the business plan that Louis did earlier this year. And this is modeled on this idea of a carpet page, which is something that exists in kind of early medieval, like illuminated manuscripts. Often the page before you got to like the gospel would be like a carpet page like this, and it's kind of like this beautiful kind of meditative moment of like focus and like readiness for the word of God. And it's often found in kind of, or an equivalent kind of thing is often also found in kind of Muslim texts, illuminated manuscripts. So it's like a kind of way of readying the mind, and it also combines with these really extraordinary drawings that were lecture aids used in the early 17th century. And so, for example, this one is talking about the structure of like the philosophical ideas within logic and epistemology. And so it's this kind of like amazing way of like trying to articulate and show like complex conceptual ideas and their relationship by placing them in kind of like a physical landscape and in an architecture with one another. They're really amazing, these plates, and I can send some of them around if people are interested. But yeah, so we've got Marina, admit. Yeah, so I guess drawing on these kind of both of these concepts, we tried to kind of develop our own one for AB as a way of being able to articulate a business plan that has a lot of like kind of complex interrelated ideas and ambitions. So we're going to kind of run through the different areas of the drawing, and that will give the kind of structure to the presentation. But yeah, essentially there's this kind of like atmospheric conditions that we're operating within. There's the kind of like more contextual area of like the work and the aims. Then in the middle, there's the practice and how it's organized, what it's working on. And then at the bottom, at the bottom is then how it's organized and how it relates to kind of different partnerships and publics. But yeah, Lou, do you want to talk about a moment in time?
So I guess starting from the imagery at the top, the idea or the way it's kind of planned out is that there's the past kind of coming, catching up to us, the future coming towards us, and there's kind of our milestones or our aims that we have within society, and we can build on those. And that's a kind of way of scenario planning or kind of working out all of the contextual factors that relate to our own actions within the world, and also kind of others' actions towards us that create what we call a social landscape we're living in. And you know, there are a number of things from that scenario kind of planning we can start to see which will unfold. So if you go to the next kind of area, some of the important things, the past, in the past that's catching up to us are kind of just highlighted here in these tarot cards. I like the idea of trying to predict the future through a series of tarot cards, and you know, the idea of welfare systems, and the kind of idea of centralized welfare systems, and how that has looked previously in the patchwork welfare systems in line with that, as well as the kind of marketization of those welfare systems, especially in the UK and abroad, and the neoliberalization of them, you know, demanding that we need maybe new forms of welfare. There's also kind of areas of the way that space standards and buildings have been restricted because of this similar agenda. The ideas of feudalism and how kind of feudalism have historically been rolled out, and kind of like colonialism, kind of interactions between those ideas, and kind of what that means for the way we live in housing and built environment today. Our technological past, the printing press, how that's defined the way we operate with things like the plan of work that we have for architecture, the ideas of our drawings, what those actually mean, all related to this kind of idea of printing press, exploitation, high carbon culture in the past, and kind of, I guess one important thing is the elitism or the embedded elitism within the profession, like 74% of architects being from privilege, is also something that embeds or creates a kind of status quo within the built environment sector and the kind of things that are built. So the idea around kind of monopolies within that, and these kinds of things just continuing to catch up with us regardless of what we're doing, these are influences, and they create part of our social landscape that we need to navigate if we want to design for a more equitable society. If we go to the next slide. And then I guess there's kind of like different weak glimmers of the future to come towards us, and we have a role to start to try and identify what those weak glimmers are in order to successfully navigate them. We have things like platform capitalism, kind of building and developing and kind of growing, where 50% of people are spending their time on, well, people are spending 50% of their time on the internet. In fact, by 2030, it's projected to be 75% of people's time is on the internet. So actually the way we operate and organize within physical space is deeply started to become rooted with our digital platforms and relationships. Kind of ideas around centralization and the centralization of companies and the end of this kind of idea of centralization towards decentralized ways of working, digital communication revolutions, changing the way and the kind of processes, the forms, the accounts and things we have and how we organize those. Ideas around new plans of work, structural changes in the architectural profession, who's representing it, what that looks like, and kind of ideas around industrial revolution. We also have drawn here, this was before a lot of the kind of issues around war and kind of we've experienced within the recent months, but here there's this kind of idea of this mass refugee crisis related to war and also related to kind of global warming, and kind of there's pictures there which is quite strange because the reality is that these are almost unfolding before they've actually unfolded. You know, you can start to see them as weak glimmers of things that could potentially happen, and we need to actually navigate and resolve things before they do happen in order to create a more equitable society. And the idea of commons and public, the development of the idea of commons and the interrelationship with the idea of public is also something that's looking like it's going to be a large trend in the structural change of the world around us. So if we go to the next slide. Yeah. Should I touch on this, or do you want to give it a go? Fran? Hello? I can't hear you, Fran.
Oh, I was saying you're on a roll. It's great. Go.
Okay, great. So the idea is, I guess, the proposition within this context is that one of the large focuses of our next epoch or our next age is going to be kind of in the areas of environmental design, social kind of, you know, trying to fix and trying to come to terms with the social problems we encounter, and also the reorganizational, but the organizational issues and the kind of organizational realities of changing both the profession that we have, but also the professions associated or affiliated with architecture, such as the construction profession and so on, the renting, the way renting works, land ownership, and all of these other organizational systems. So these kind of three areas start to kind of like define within the context that I've just framed a new pathway for architectural practice, which I believe starts to be known as social architecture practice. So, for example, we might start to focus on carbon lowering interventions, how agriculture kind of changes, and kind of how we rethink and renew buildings, as well as the social parameters around social architecture services, which are more like and understanding the true needs of people, and then designing light interventions for those, and developing initiatives and developing a body of research that allows us to kind of build new forms of space, which aren't just spatial, but are mental and social too. And as well as that, the organizational thing, which is highly connected to those two areas that I've already mentioned, which is changing not just the hardware of the city, but also the software, not in terms of computer programming, but in terms of like the things that are interrelated or within the built environment, and not just the built environment itself. And that's, I think, a very key aspect of kind of like grappling with new ways of working, especially with all of these issues that we have to navigate. Yeah.
So I guess, yeah, after kind of identifying those three areas, then we've been trying to think about, the aims of AB, or at least draft aims, the beginning aims. So to design new architectures, prototypes for expanding the welfare state to create a more equitable society, to rework the practice of architecture in response to climate catastrophe, to design with an understanding of how immaterial systems, language, law, economics, policy, identity, and power concretely shape our lives, explore forms of networked practice made possible through new technology, and create systems that protect and create wealth with those who are most vulnerable. So, I mean, you can kind of see that those things will start to like address like many different layers. Ooh, I've got another person in the thing. Yeah, so the process of growing this organization has kind of been going on now for the last couple of years. Many conversations in many groups in many places, looking at different kind of topics and areas that have like now like evolved into where we're at currently. So yeah, 2020 we came to assemble to do just spreading the good word of NFS, and then he came and helped out doing some research and sort of initial kind of learning around cybernetics in at House Veneta, and then there was a series of kind of EASA workshops and presentations that we were involved with last summer, which obviously some of you were at, which was really great that now you're here. And then there's been kind of research and writing ongoing in the background. Louie's been working with City of Sanctuary, which we'll touch on again in a minute, but it's kind of like resource centre and social centre for refugees and asylum seekers in Sheffield. There's been the Commons proposal, which has kind of evolved, I guess, in parallel with some of this thinking. And then I did a research trip at the end of last year in autumn, looking at lots of different projects around Europe, which are addressing systemic issues in different ways and different levels. And so, yeah, now we've kind of got to this point where we're here at this presentation where we felt like things had got to a kind of stage where it felt like there was more clarity around like the way that this new practice and this kind of decentralized idea of exchange and infrastructure could start to function. And so and projects are actually happening now, so it feels really important to be able to like talk about where we're at and to share our intentions for the future, and hopefully that, yeah, just as a way of like people being able to start to feed into things in a more direct way. So I guess from all these conversations that have been happening over the 2 years, as some of you will recognize some of these questions, there's just, you know, many questions that feel really urgent in relation to the way that we're working and learning and interacting with the world. And these questions are the thing that has kind of led to this grouping of organizational, social, and environmental concerns. And we've gone through a process of kind of like consolidating, trying to like gather and group questions under these areas. But so there's things like in organizational projects, what would an alternative plan of work look like? Can we make an international DAO architecture practice? How might we structure finance and projects to reorient power dynamics? How do we expand open source architectural design? And then basically within each of these questions, so the alternative plan of work then like splits out almost like the kind of roots of a tree into like, you know, another 20 or so questions. And like obviously this is a kind of infinite process, but there's a way of kind of like trying to channel and at least like gather together similar ideas. And so yeah, if we think about what would an alternative plan of work look like, the kind of sub questions within that have been emerging through conversations are, what if we rethought architectural delivery as part and parcel of the spaces we create? What if the methodology designed labor and relational structures first before physical ones? Can you work with decentralized clients rather than individual clients? How can we work in a way that reorients power dynamics? What if the economy of the city was thought of as part of the ecosystem when designing a space? What if the RIBA plan was redesigned to overcome assumptions of the petrochemical era? How do the architectures of language interact our structure of thought? And how might we rethink key documents and conceptual tools, I guess like contracts and stuff, designers use to manage their work. So then the idea is, yeah, there's this kind of like process of drilling down into different or spreading out into different research questions, but that these questions will, like, they're the things that essentially kind of guide and structure the projects. So each project will be kind of structured around the interrogation of, or the exploration of, a particular question. And none of those projects, will be the answer. They will be an answer at a moment in time. And this, wanted to show this slide. This is really beautiful maps of the Mississippi moving over time. So you can see the kind of layered trajectories of the river as it's wound through the landscape and as it's kind of moved over time. So I guess, yeah, this idea of that the answers are multiple and that they're changing and that they're conditional on the kind of circumstances of that time and that moment. So I think it's really important that these research projects are also like iterative. So it's like, for instance, in the Joiners Arms project, trying to think about like how we question or like try and hold the process in a way that can change the power, the kind of usual power dynamics and the kind of harmful effects of those power structures in the way that we're designing the delivery. And so hopefully, yeah, this will be an opportunity to test out some ideas, and then we'll learn some things from that, and then be nice to bring that learning to another process and to try and like test it and refine it. And so these things can like start to build on themselves, and also then to be shared as kind of new knowledge across the AB network. So yeah, this is just, I guess, a slide to show that these roots of inquiry are like starting to blossom into like different activities and conversations and people moving around the country and doing work. And one of the, well, at least I guess one of the key projects I'm working on at the moment, which is based in London, just off Brick Lane, is House of Annetta, which is a kind of social centre and resource space for people working on land justice and housing justice. And a project that hopefully tries to embody some of the principles that might offer a different way of relating to land and property. So I guess the question for this project is, how do we design projects to redress the imbalance in land distribution? And then to try and like unpack the project in a way to think about that on multiple levels, like what's the organizational structure you're setting up that will like manage the space, like who can access the space and on what terms, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
So one of the major projects that I was working on was the idea of a national food service. So coined this term national food service is a first prototype of what a new welfare system could look like, which is more rhizombic and also has is rooted in kind of ideas of commons as they develop. So the idea was that kind of we can eliminate food insecurity within our lives with just the resources we have. And the creation of this national food service network is still building today. Now, this is a really good example of like, across the country, during COVID, for example, it fed 200,000 people who were unable to access food in that period. And that's a good example of why we need a national food service. But there's also, kind of an example of the UK is going into a position where we're looking at enormous food insecurity, and it's starting on the margins, but it starts to come into the center over time. And the reality is there's kind of going to be shortages in lots of different areas if the kind of food infrastructure stays in the way it is. And we need to understand that isn't just represented in the amount of food that's on the shelves, but also the amount of food reaching people. So people might not have enough money for food, which is a breakdown in distributional infrastructure. So ideas around how we actually tackle that problem head on was something we started to provide and propose with the National Food Service. Now, there's a lot of work to be done in this area, and there's a lot of enormous work that we can do to forward the idea of welfare service or welfare system, such as like how we reduce ideas of stigma, how we create communal luxury and create ideas of commons, which are really prioritizing new kind of forms of welfare, which are actually celebrate culture and meaning within communities, and enrich the fabric of those communities as part of a holistic form of integration within the city. And that's something that is one example of that. But there's a lot of other examples that through the medium of AB I would like to explore new forms of welfare and new forms of system. And I think that one of the interesting things about the National Food Service is it followed this prototyping, testing at small architectural scale, and then expanding, because that was, a root problem, a real problem that we need to solve. And it allowed us to, I guess, disembark from the kind of the mass graveyard of assumptions that architects have, and actually say, well, maybe there's something, a different pathway that we can do, which is rooted more in logic and reality with the real world we're actually living in, what's really happening in the world, so there's obviously this kind of idea of mutual education. Now I've been an advocate, and I'm a great believer in mutual education. I guess most people in this room are come from IASA or engaged with IASA at some point. But yeah, I've been in IASA for a long time now, over 7 years, and it's mainly because it's something I really believe has a nucleus of what the future of education could actually look like. At least it could be a seed for that. And I guess
Could you just explain what IASA is, just for the people?
So IASA is Europe's longest running mutualist education system that has been running for over 40 years. And it's a kind of fairly unique example of distributed international decision making running. And I don't think there's ever an organization in the world quite like it, actually. And every year it's reformed annually by a new voluntary group who essentially takes the initiative on and reforms it to create an event and series of educational systems. Now there's 30 to 40 workshops each year where over 600 people attend and live and work together for a two-week period. But there's also a number of emerging satellite events that have spun off from this. The number's too big to kind of mention, but some examples are Heterotopia in Italy. There's kind of examples around the kind of Ukrainian CISAM event that was in Chernobyl they went to Chernobyl. And there's kind of all of these other events that have essentially spun off of IASA and created a new, I guess, distributed educational platform. And there's a lot of work to be done to develop that. But I guess a lot of people in this room are deeply engaged in how we develop that and how we move that forward. And that's quite an exciting prospect. But also the idea that mutualist education systems that are open and free might actually someday flip the current educational system we have is quite an exciting prospect for me, because our educational system right now has extreme access issues, extreme kind of because of the fees, because of the kind of like the systems within which you access them, and all these other issues that come through. So IASA being free and distributed and is a good example of how we might do things differently, and how also education might be sped up. So the older generation and the younger generation, there's only a few years between them often, and that allows a quicker exchange of knowledge that is more suiting, I believe, to our age, because in the last 10 years we've had more technological change than the last 200 years combined. So it means that you need students and teachers to be closer and closer together in age in order to increase efficiency of the knowledge that's transferred. So yeah, not going to go on too much about that, but the idea is mutualist education systems, thinking about how we continue to develop them through various means. And finally, kind of like, here's an example of how we create infrastructure for hospitality and sanctuary. I've been working closely with a group called the City of Sanctuary, and been using what I would call I did a write-up called Universal Processes for Social Architecture, which essentially gives a guideline of how you can practice as a social architect, and develop user stories and kind of develop a synchronized process. And I've been working with Seat of Sanctuary and other, a refugee organization, an organization that helps and supports refugees and asylum seekers, to essentially listen to all of the community members and develop the space through feedback loops of iteration. And this is kind of, I guess, a model that I'm hoping we can develop and build on with different groups. And I've used this same model with the Foodle project, and we've spoken about kind of similar models with the House of Veneta and so on. So it's starting to build that kind of thing in relation to the issues that we see in society today. So
you want to talk about the institutional accommodation, just the piece of research?
Oh yeah, so currently doing a lot of research on institutional accommodation, I guess, probing what sorry, this is a different thread from the one I went down, but yeah, there's some research within that strand of thinking, because we've worked with this organization. They said, well, there's one problem, which is, Seat of Sanctuary is actually a very good organization that is actually dealing with a lot of these head on, and actually the people running it are amazing, I would say, in terms of their ability to understand the needs of the people there. There are a lot of organizations that are perhaps intentionally marginalizing, stigmatizing, and repressing refugees in a number of areas, and this is often highly spatial. So institutional accommodation is surprisingly surprisingly simple and complex at the same time. We've discovered, so we were kind of researching what institutional accommodation is, what people in institutional accommodation need, and quite frankly, there's a few shocking things that we found in particular around kind of where institutional accommodation is strategically placed to ensure that people are kind of taken away or removed from their networks, and some other issues that could potentially inform and help the inhabitants kind of gain support a little bit more easily. So just thinking robustly around what the interventions, and I guess strategically around what's the lowest cost, the highest impact interventions we can do in those quite tricky areas, especially in relation to all of the enormous Priti Patel government legislation that's coming into full force at the moment. We need to think really kind of strategically and intelligently about where we place our effort. We can't just do fundraisers for refugees and kind of virtue signal about it. We need to kind of like actually think more kind of in an integrated way that kind of like relates to the reality of the context we're seeing, and kind of how we can help those things, help those support those areas in through social architecture practice.
AB got a bit of research money that Lou's been working through over the past few months to look into this area, and the idea is that there'll be a report produced with like a series of like proposals about architectural, physical and non-physical interventions that could start to kind of ameliorate or like interact with the system in like in a smart way. So yeah, it feels good. It feels really good to be working on this area, because obviously it's just going to be such a form, it's just going to keep on getting more and more, more intense, I think, as the years go on. So it's really important to try and interact with it. Yeah, maybe let's just speed up a little bit, because I think we've been talking for quite a long time, but we'll try and be a bit shorter on the ending.
Yeah. I'll kind of hit these few slides on the nose right now, but yeah, one of the ideas is that hopefully by bridging or connecting closer with VIASA, we might be able to do projects in different areas across the world, and also bridge using new technologies like DAOs. We might be able to bridge new kind of infrastructures where people can essentially have an element of ownership over the AB project, and kind of what we call a fair share of it, you know. So there's these ideas of how we distribute fair shares. There's a lot of writing and research about that. So the idea is we can develop some kind of contracts, smart contracts around how we distribute ownership in fractional shares and things like that, and how we navigate that as we expand as a community and develop as a practice. And we'll be the, you know, hopefully one of the first architecture organizations to experiment with this kind of technology. So that's exciting. And other ideas around how we make open resources to support architectural design. So we will kind of working with group in Ghent. I'm not sure if Ben's here at the moment, but yeah, we were connecting with them, Ben and Emma, who we're developing some resources around kind of how organizations work and things like that. So hopefully we can build these into resources that are more open and are more shared, so that they can develop and build as collective projects within the AB infrastructure. Yeah. Does that feel? Yeah. And this is you.
Yeah, this was just, I guess, out of the research project last year. Then Asker and myself made a short film, or like a kind of first draft, of a film, which hopefully will get expanded, looking at the kind of interaction between material and like social experiences of living together, and the kind of possible ways that can be can be like improvised with, basically.
Oh yeah, we can skip this, but there's another project as well we're working on. So
I mean, yeah, maybe we talked a bit about what alternative plan of work looked like, just to say like one iteration of like alternative ways of working is something that we're looking at through the Joiners Arms project, which Imani's a part of. And yeah, just I guess like ways of thinking about the nature of work and the culture of it, and yeah, critically how we might begin to build cultures of care, and like yeah, just feels really exciting. And to be, for those people who don't know, the Joiners Arms was a LGBT plus pub that was has since been developed, but there was a campaign to try and save it, and out of that campaign has kind of formed this group and this community who run kind of drag nights and stuff, and they're about to set up like a temporary event space in East London. So it also feels really nice to be thinking critically about I guess like social relations and processes in the context of a kind of like significant like queer space. Yeah, feels really like a powerful moment, so it's cool. This picture's us dressed up in architectural drag in suits. One of the meetings that we had. Yeah. Merging organization. Should we just, I feel like we've kind of
we've touched on it. Yeah. So essentially there's kind of the idea of developing a culture rather than just being around kind of I guess values, but more about kind of developing cultural alignment and cultural development, and the idea of kind of leadership and not be just having a kind of a beautiful equilibrium in how leadership works in different projects are run and managed by different groups. Like we kind of ensuring that is developed well, and there are leaders, but those leaders are kind of doing things with a lot of accountability and kind of doing things to a high degree of quality, as well as that, like kind of how those structures work in practice, and those things are kind of made through this idea of how we develop our contracts, how we develop our systems and our processes. And yeah, so we're not going to go into that too much, but the idea is that hopefully we can like continue to develop and build our culture with research in these areas, and make sure the architectural organization is really research led in that area. So yeah, if there's anything else you want to touch on that, Fran.
No, I guess something that we don't have a slide about, but I think is important to say is that, like, yeah, there's this, because it is that dream is, you know, for a kind of decentralized organization, and that there'll be a kind of exchange between, like, you know, project and this like kind of interconnected web of AB. And so, like, there'll be some things that AB can provide, like, you know, a kind of platform for exchange, like an annual kind of rhythm of like show and tells, and also like an annual gathering where people can, like, you know, learn from each other and connect over what they're working on. And that also projects would be able to access insurance and financial infrastructure if they need it, but then would be also kind of contributing back to a centralized kind of community wealth fund, which would then be redistributed. So it's kind of like trying to also build in these mechanisms of exchange and kind of like redistribution through the organization itself. The idea is that, yeah, income streams will come from various different places: grants, consultancy work, design and build projects, ultimately maybe like asset development, you know, if there are like potentially like sites of education, or yeah, possible kind of like spaces for like longer term relationship with a particular place. We don't really know what that looks like right now. And then potentially, yeah, the sale of this research as well. I might not talk about this in great detail, but I guess just to say that there's an idea that, yeah, in the next few months we're trying to send out this presentation to a number of different people sharing the ideas. With the City of Sanctuary stuff is kind of wrapping up. The Friends of Joiners Arms stuff is like kind of really just beginning to start properly, well, in its first phase, and we're like having to have conversations around like the financial infrastructure that we're setting up and like incorporating and things like this. So there's quite a lot going on. And then, yeah, I guess there's like stages, like 4 years for quite a good chunk, and that the ambition for that would then be like some of the projects we're working on now will have like realized a certain like point. So maybe House Veneta will be fully operational. Hopefully the Asa Commons project will have, you know, an amazing experimental education space that's kind of continuing to operate. And that there'll be an international network of smaller research projects all feeding into this AB structure. And then in 2 decades, yeah, maybe this community wealth fund could be something that actually sustains continual work and like can have like meaningful impact into areas of need that don't have the financial support currently, and supporting kind of research in places which wouldn't be able to happen otherwise. And yeah, that hopefully at that point there would be some kind of like paradigm shift where some of the stuff that feels like it's so outdated and so just like mindless in kind of current world systems, hopefully there'll be a shift in some of that thinking, of which we hope to be a part of. And Lou, do you want to add anything to
that? Yeah, that was a great summary. I don't think I've got anything to add to that, actually. I think that's
just about
yeah, that's it. But I guess this is the end of slide, isn't it? That communication is key, and we're going to keep, I guess the idea is to do this presentation, especially with Yasser and Friends of Joiners Arms and people who are involved with Sheffield, is to share what we're up to give an update, and then kind of keep the conversation building. So if some of the people are already involved with some of these projects and like giving a bit of clarity around what AB looks like right now and some of the key ideas, and kind of starting dialogue around it, and also kind of building that communication, sharing presentations and stuff is important thing. Do you want to do the closer, Fran?
No, I think we've said everything, I guess. Yeah, it'd just be great to hear if anyone has any thoughts or questions or comments or yeah, but
I have one question. I'm sorry, I didn't really understand what the abbreviation for DAO stands for. Can you explain that to me, please?
All right. So a DAO stands for Decentralized Autonomous Organization, and it's a new form of organization, internet-based organization that's developed and advanced in recent years. And there's a lot of new groups that are kind of setting up or experimenting with the idea of DAOs. Essentially, it means that you can have multiple shareholders a little bit easier than traditional company structures, which are defined by quite heavy bureaucracy, whereas this is quite light on the bureaucracy and uses the internet and tools that have been invented in recent years a little bit quicker. So that's what DAO is, and it's emerging. So it's kind of like trialing it out and trying something new with it is exciting, but also there's an element of risk there in the relationship to like, what does that look like? Will it work? And so on. So yeah, it's interesting. Yeah.
Another question that I was thinking about, are you going to like political factions around England, or is it gonna involve like traditional politics in any way?
I think the idea is that we will take a more like social science approach to architecture. So, you know, I guess the concept is to like understand what the root needs are, observe what they are, build a hypothesis around them, and then test that and kind of work with that methodology, because that starts to build an evidence base and a truth. You know, what we're trying to do is work within truth. Do you see what I mean? Like work within truth and be grounded within truth, which, you know, trends in architecture and kind of, I guess, political trends and mainstream political trends can be so far removed from the truth at some points that you don't even know what's going on. You're just like, oh my God, there's just people saying things and they're just talking in definitions and not in truths. So hopefully we'll kind of like work with what's really happening and what people really, really need. And that will be the kind of primary focus in relation to the kind of thing. Obviously, that we might work with groups who will have, you know, problems that are related to politics and things like that, and also have political kind of, you know, intentions and agendas. Like, you know, many of the places we're working, for example, refugees is not an apolitical space to be looking at. But I guess the important thing to note is the reason we're looking at it is because there's a high degree of need that's unmet there.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know? And there's a high degree of real kind of like real people that are actually, you know, in difficulty in that space, and we need to look at that as truth and actually what do they really need and what do people really need, and that is the
I was asking because at least for Romania, like 10 years ago, there was a political party who wanted to change the paradigm. Let's say they wanted to make the right for housing a fundamental right recognized in the constitution, but because of people saying, why should I pay for somebody's house, they just ended up dissolving for good. But their main aim was to make housing like a human right, not just a privilege or luxury.
Yeah. So do you want to go?
Yeah, I feel like obviously, well, not obviously, but all of the work is political. Like it does touch on politics. I think that's just like inescapable in probably in anything. I think we're definitely not interested in like, this isn't like a political project in terms of like engaging with politics as a political system. I think one of the things that's quite interesting about like the way that the NHS evolved and the way that then the NFS, the National Food Service, was set up is like this idea of like that on a small scale in a town, you can have a model of an organization or system or of service provision that is like offers a different way of how things could be structured in the world, and then like sometimes that can get scaled up, and sometimes that's a national, you know, that's the role of the state, and sometimes it's not. But I think our strength is really in like trying to develop these alternative projects as a way of testing ideas and just being able to talk about that. And I think staying away from party politics, I mean, I'm just not interested in this being anything to do with that, because I think it's just a really toxic environment and a really toxic system, and you just get involved in like really bad, like, no, my phone's going, yeah, really bad thing. So yeah, that's one thing I would say.
Thank you.
And there are, for example, Fran just touched on it with the National Food Service as an example, that did influence policy. It was, you know, because we did these things, you know, we can then, people then can go, okay, look at that as an example, let's write policy on that. But the reality is that by even then, it wasn't, the intention wasn't initially to write policy, do you know? It was that somebody, you know, somebody wrote policy, or we collaborated with someone and we helped them shape a policy that would be put forward to mitigate food insecurity because of the findings we had, which were related to what our work that we've done, do you know? So it was kind of, that's the way we would engage with politics as a social, you know, social science, I guess. In the same way you might say we need zero carbon because, you know, we can see that there's a hole in the ozone layer, you know. So
I wanted to say something else on, actually, I remembered, just about this idea of social science and like practice. And I guess maybe for some people watching this might feel more or less drawn towards this idea of like scientific process. But I think for me, it can be that, but it also is a, you know, it's an artistic practice. It's like a creative practice, a way of like thinking about design as a kind of expansive form of work that is engaging in like many levels and trying to think differently. So I guess like, yeah, yeah, I guess it's like a kind of work that you could kind of frame it in a number of different ways. But I think it's, yeah, important. The language kind of doesn't really exist, right? So that's why sometimes there's a kind of association that you put to certain like fields of work. But I think, yeah, as a kind of artistic design practice, which is also social science, which is also a form of architecture, you know, it's all these things. Yeah, just wanted to say that. Maybe just any last questions, because I'm realizing what time is, and we've been here for, it's Sunday, so yeah. Anyone got any others? No.
Well, I mean, I guess I was just gonna not say anything, and then just, we've got like a meeting immediately after. But I guess I'll say something now. Yeah, thanks so much, guys. It's like, it's really interesting to see, like, to be talked through that carpet image finally and understand like what's going on in each section. And, like, finally, I think I understand what your intention is. And I was just going to say, like, if we were planning on having like a digital commons event in July, and I wonder if that could be a good opportunity to expand, like use it as like a workshop for like expanding the ideas around the DAO, like what that could look like. I don't know. But yeah, I don't know. There's like, it's still like, there's so many different like things that you covered in your presentation. It's kind of like interesting to see which direction you'll, I don't know, I guess it depends on what projects like come your way. Like, yeah, I like the idea of the like Mississippi, they like goes like in a mad direction.
Cool.
Yeah. Maybe just to say that the plan, there's an idea that because things have started happening, there's like obviously the Commons, the Joiners Arms, there's the City of Frankfurt stuff, that we want to start doing like show and tell so that everyone can actually understand like what the, you know, what the thinking is, how, like what's live in those projects. And maybe, yeah, just like a monthly thing where we just have like an hour sitting together and like hearing what each other's up to. I think would be really nice. So we might try and organize one of them for June sometime, which would be cool. And then, yeah, at some point in the summer, it'd be really great to like try and get people connected to different projects physically in the same space as well. So that we can maybe have a couple of days hanging out and like developing some of the thinking a bit more and just sharing what, just like eating together and hanging out, you know, just so that people like understand and like feel more connected. I think it's really important. Yeah. Oh, yeah, maybe. Thanks for giving up your time on a Sunday.
Can I just say something?
Yeah. You're on the
Okay,
beat.
I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah.
I'm at Ibiza.
Hey!
I am Marina, and friend, it is pleasure to meet you, really, and thank you both. Like it's beautiful, like what's going on, and I'm not gonna give any specific comments. I wrote down some stuff, and I just wanted to send you warm greets from here and to have some vibe. And yeah, I'm really happy to collaborate. Yeah, at some point, or if you need some help or whatever. Yeah. Good to meet you guys, and many, many, many kisses.
Yeah.
Ciao.
Cool. Oh, it's so grey here. Okay, well, yeah, I'm gonna stop the recording.